Thank you for tuning in to watch or to listen to this message today. Wherever you are, at home, in your car, on your computer, on your phone, we're just excited that you're spending time with us. We are on a mission here at CRB to lead people to know and love Jesus. And so if you call this place your home, I encourage you to visit our Give page on our website, where you can find a few easy ways to faithfully support God's work here at the church, financially, through online giving. At CRB, we believe that love will save the world, and the best place to do that is in the local church. So if you live in San Diego or if you're visiting the area, we just want to invite you to come join us on a weekend, come hang out with us, and be a part of the family here. Enjoy the message.
When I was growing up in church, it seemed like every single week I would go to church. Our preacher would stand on the stage and he would talk about money. And some of you grew up in a church or faith system that was like that. At our church, it seemed like you'd walk in, at least half the time, there'd be a giant red thermometer on stage. Some of you grew up that way. And we knew when the thermometer got to a particular level of red, the preacher would stop asking for money, and we would finally just build the building or buy the van or whatever it was we were trying to raise money for. And I didn't really care. I was 7 or 10 years old, but my parents would grumble about it. And I have vivid memories of being a kid and hearing my parents complain about the preacher, the pastor, talking about money. And if you've been hanging around church for a while, you remember some of this, but every week we'd walk in, there would be the Annie Armstrong Easter offering or the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. There was always somebody's name attached to it that I didn't know, but they would ask for money, and it was a big deal. And we talked about money at our church growing up all the time. And so I made a decision when I became a preacher or a pastor, a professional Christian, that I was not going to talk about money in church, because I just remember those memories of my mom, my dad grumbling about talking about money in church, which leads to a very good question. Then, Jared, why are we going to talk about money in church? I'm glad you asked. Here's the reason. Because when I read the New Testament, when I read the Gospels, if you just take the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you just read the words in red, the words that Jesus spoke, Jesus talks about money all the time. In fact, more than Jesus talks about prayer, more than Jesus talks about heaven and hell combined, Jesus talks about money. And one of the things you discover when you read the Gospels is that Jesus isn't just trying to get people out of here when they die. He's trying to get people while they're alive to manage their resources, their money, in a way that honors God. In fact, if you read the New Testament, the words of Jesus, it seems that if you just kind of counted it up, 1 out of every 3 verses, 1 out of every 3 times Jesus is speaking, he's talking about money. If I talked about money as much as Jesus talked about money, 1 out of every 3 weekends at CRB, we would be talking about money. I think I'm doing pretty good, to be honest with you. We don't talk about money that much. But one of the things you discover in the New Testament is that you cannot be a wholehearted follower of Jesus and not talk about money. You can't just sort of ignore your financial world and say, when it comes to money, it's my money, I worked hard for it, and I'm not going to talk about money. I'm just going to sort of spend it the way I want, do what I want. You cannot, it's impossible when you read the words of Jesus to be a wholehearted follower of Jesus and ignore your financial world. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the Game of Thrones, money, the way that Jesus in the scriptures talks about money. Now, I know for some of us, as you hear that, there's that cringe thing that goes off inside of you. In fact, you're already sort of elbowing your husband or wife going, I think we can make it to another church if we leave right now. We've locked the back doors, okay, just so you know. But the reason, if I could just have a shot here, the reason why you cringe when you hear a preacher or pastor talk about money is because most of the sermons or people like me standing on stage talking about money have been angled in 3 different directions. You've heard sermons talk about money in such a way that it's aimed at your emotions. It's aimed at your emotions. And there's a guilt factor often when you hear these sermons where somebody like me stands up and says, hey, there's a group of people overseas or there's a group of people in our city and they don't have what they need. And you greedy Americans have more than you need and you should give money to this or give money to this. And you should feel guilty for the things that you have. In fact, some of you have left church before after hearing sermons like that and you felt guilty for even getting in a car. You know what I'm talking about? And you looked at your wife or you looked at your husband and said, we're trading the car in for a donkey. We shouldn't even have a car. And there's that guilt. It's aimed at the emotion. The problem is Jesus, when he talked about money, it was never from a position of guilt, or it was never some sort of emotional manipulation to get you to give money. I'm certainly not saying every sermon like that is emotional manipulation. But Jesus, when he talks about money, it's very different. Many of the sermons you've heard about money have just been purely intellectual. And they might involve a thermometer, and they say something like this: if 10 of you gave, a certain amount, we could build a building, we could end this particular human rights crisis, we could do this, and it's a good investment if you just sort of run the numbers. That if you just did this, it's sort of an intellectual appeal for money. There's another way that oftentimes, and this is probably the most cringeworthy, at least for me, is when you hear these sermons that are aimed not at your emotion or not at your intellect, but at the will. If you just had enough willpower, if you just did what Jesus said to do in terms of money, you'd give it to this, or you'd do better in this area. And if you don't do this, God is going to get you. I mean, you got to try harder. You got to do more. And when you read the words of Jesus, the words in red in the New Testament, Jesus never makes an emotional or intellectual or just try harder appeal. When Jesus talks about money, he talks about it in terms of the heart. And Jesus assumes that at the core of every single one of us in this room, there is a throne at the center of your heart. I brought this in from my dining room. It's a statement piece, if you will. Bought it at Jerome's. Jesus assumes that at the core of who you are, this is true whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. This is not a Christian thing. This is just a human being thing. That you have a throne at the core of your heart. And something is going to end up on the throne of your heart. And this is true for you. This is true for me. You will become a slave to whatever is on the throne of your heart. Something, this is not a Christian thing. This is a human being thing. Something will have mastery over you. And Jesus knows that his greatest competition, because what God ultimately wants isn't your money. What God ultimately wants isn't even your time. What God ultimately wants is the throne of your heart. And Jesus talks about money all the time because he knows his greatest competition for the throne of your heart is not the devil. It's your money. And so he talks about money, seems to be more than he talks about anything else. You will become a slave. Jesus knows this in his infinite wisdom. You will become a slave to whatever it is that ends up on the throne of your heart. If it's beauty, if it's retaining beauty or becoming beautiful, you will become a slave to beauty. You won't use those words, but you will sacrifice your health. You will sacrifice relationships. You will sacrifice things that are incredibly valuable to you because beauty has mastery over you. If it's power at work in your industry that sits on the throne of your heart, you will sacrifice a marriage. You will sacrifice relationship with kids. All of your life will become oriented around whatever sits on the throne of your heart. And Jesus knows that when you talk about money, you're really talking about this. Something that ends up on the throne of our heart, and it's the greatest competition to your affection. It's the greatest competition to your ability to serve and follow God. So he talks about money all the time because it's about the throne of your heart. And for the next few weeks, just to kind of put everybody at ease, this is not a giving series. This is not about an HBO series, okay? But before HBO had us, we don't even endorse that show, by the way. We're not going to show clips from that show. But before HBO talked about a Game of Thrones, Jesus talked about a very different Game of Thrones at the core of our heart, between God and money. If you have a Bible, open it to Luke chapter 16. If you don't have a Bible, you can just follow along on the screens, or you can download the CRB app, and there's a section in there, you can open in the app, and there's a section in there that says message notes, and it's a great place to follow along. And instead of me trying to explain what Jesus says about money, we're just going to read for the next few weeks some things that Jesus says about money. Luke chapter 16, Matthew, Mark, the book of Luke. And it was a popular teaching technique of Jesus to tell stories. These stories, if you've been hanging around church for a while, are called parables. He would tell these parables, and they're not true stories. They're true to the extent that they point to a bigger truth. It's a common teaching technique of Jesus. And he tells this story that is set at the center of Christian history for 2,000 years as sort of a brilliant teaching on how God views our possessions and money. And it's a fascinating story because on the surface, it's called the parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus seems to be elevating the actions of a shady businessman. If you have a Bible, Luke chapter 16, we're just going to go ahead and dive in, starting in verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, so there's a crowd that's gathered. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So there's two people. There's a rich man or a master and a manager. And the manager's accused of wasting the possessions of the master. So he called him in and he asked him, "What is this I hear about you?" Now, the original audience, they would know that if a master had caught a manager doing something shady in his business practice, he could have him thrown in jail. So right here, they know that he hasn't thrown him in jail. He's actually just fired him, which is actually, this is a story about a merciful master to the audience that's listening. What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. And the audience that would hear this, they would understand one sentence into this story that Jesus is telling, that there is a master and there is a manager. Anybody want to take a stab at who the master is supposed to be in the story? Who's the master? Jesus, yeah, always a good answer in church. Jesus. God is God, Jesus is the master. Who's the manager in the story? Anybody? Us, yes, we the people are the manager in the story. And so they understand at the very beginning, at the very outset, this is a story about a master, and this is a story about a manager. The Greek word for this is oikonomos, for manager, which is a great word, oikonomos. It would translate steward, if you've heard that word before, or manager. But they would understand, and I would imagine one sentence in, just like in our culture, there would be people that would begin to push back from this story, because the assumption is, in the story that Jesus is telling, is that we are not the owners of our possessions, money, and stuff. God is the owner of all things. God is the owner of your checkbook. God is the owner of your money. And he has merely allowed you and allowed me for a window of time called your life to manage, to steward, to oikonomos, the possessions of God. Now, right there, one sentence in, this is true for Jesus and Jesus' audience, and it's true for us. This cuts against the grain, the fabric of how we think about money. Because we think when it comes to money, I know I certainly do, it's my money. I worked hard for it, and nobody's getting my money. I earned it. I've worked hard for it. I'm in control of it. To which the scriptures would reply, how did you get your money? Well, I woke up, I breathed in, I breathed out. Well, where does breath come from? Where does your ability to breathe in and breathe out, that ability to be alive? You are being held together by the creator of all things. And being alive is a pretty core prerequisite to making money. Your breath comes from God. All things come from God. To which we reply, well, I've got some gifts. I've got an education. I apply my gifts, my faculties for reasoning to my particular craft or my field, and that's how I make money. To which I would ask, and to which God would ask, where did you get your talents? Well, they came from my mom. She's good with numbers, and that's where does she get her talents? Ultimately, you will find yourself back at the throne of God, that God is the giver of all things, your talents, your breath, to which we reply, well, I've worked hard. I've overcome circumstances. I got a good education. I worked and put my way through college to get where I am in life. To which, God will reply, you are the benefactor, all of us are, of a certain set of circumstances. If you had been born 500 years ago on a mountain in Bolivia, you could have worked as hard as you would have liked, and you were not going to get very far financially. The reality is for all of us, born into the world and the circumstances that we are, that you are benefiting currently from having breath in your lungs, you are benefiting from a set of talents that have been given to you, and you are benefiting from a set of circumstances. And God says, as a result of all that, I'm the owner. You are the manager. And for a window of time, I'm going to give you the opportunity to manage money, to manage resources. For some of us, it's $10. For some of us, it's $10 million. But all of us have an opportunity to be a steward, an oikonomos of the resources of God. And if we push back on that, if we never understand that, if that's a strain for us, all of the Christian faith will be a struggle for you. Because the essence of the Christian faith is that you are a recipient of a love that you did not earn. And now you are a manager of possessions that are not yours. So in the very first sentence, Jesus sets the paradigm. Welcome to management. You are a manager, not an owner of possessions that God has entrusted to you for a little window of time called your life. He keeps going in the story. I would have been done right there. Thank you, Jesus. I'm out. But he keeps going in the story. The manager said to himself, who's just been fired, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of the master's debtors. He has no authority to do this. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" The pink slip has been issued. He's supposed to go home, but he's not. He's calling in. He knows he has this little window of time before the master finds out and all the clients find out. And so he's going to get to work trying to sort of fix this scenario of losing his job. Verse 6, 900 gallons of olive oil. The first guy replies, "That's what I owe." The manager tells him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly." The reason he wants him to do this quickly is because he doesn't want the master to come back in the middle of all this. "Sit down quickly and make it 450. So he cuts the bill in half. Then he asks the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied, which is a great sum of money. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. Now, for us, we kind of read over some of these details, but the original audience, this is a cliffhanger of a story. They would be on the edge of their seat because they know that in this culture, the manager has put the master in a crisis. Because in this culture, the highest form of nobility for a man is to be a generous man. And the master would know when he discovers what the manager has done, that at the town pub in the center of town, there would be celebration. There would be cheers to the master who's generous, to the manager who's been generous. And so he knows, for the audience that's listening to this, well, what's the master going to do? They would know this master would be in a dilemma. He's got to weigh his options. What am I supposed to do? He can't go back to these guys and say, "Well, I'm sorry, there's been a mistake. You know, he didn't have the right to do that. He was actually fine." He knows that that's not an option. The audience knows that. So here is what the master does. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. "Touché," he says. "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." And then he gets very specific about how a manager should view possessions. Use worldly wealth. I tell you, use worldly wealth for a purpose. To gain friends for yourselves, not in such a way that you have a bunch of hangers-on because you have money, but so that when it is gone, when you die essentially, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now that's sort of an odd thing, but he brings eternity, heaven, hell. He brings eternity into the discussion. And he says, I want you to use your money for a purpose. And it's to gain friends for yourself. So the first thing he says, when a manager thinks about money, stewarding the possessions of God, the first thing I want you to understand is that money is a tool. He says, I want you to use money. It has a purpose. And we understand that a tool is not an end to itself. It is a means to an end. It has a purpose bigger than itself to do something else. And Jesus says, I want you to understand that the point of money is it's a tool. That when your possessions are gone, when you die, we all understand that we do not get to take anything with us into the great beyond, into that moment when you meet Morgan Freeman in a white building in a white suit. Nothing comes with us. But he says what will last is the eternal difference that you have made in somebody else's life. that will actually last. That I don't know what it's like, but when you get to heaven, that what eternal difference you have used with the resources that you have been given in this life, the way that you have used your possessions, if you viewed them as yours for yourself and your kingdom, he says, that's not the way I want you to think about it. View your money in this life as a tool to make an eternal difference in somebody else's life, to make friends for yourself in eternal dwellings. This got seared into my heart, this idea of money being a tool to make eternal friends. Got seared into my heart when I was about 18 years old. I was an intern at a church in the youth ministry department, this church in the north side of Atlanta, Georgia. And in our youth ministry, I had a youth pastor named Kevin. We had a couple, he kind of ran the program. He's still a mentor of mine to this very day. And there was about 200 kids or so in our youth ministry. And there was a man in our church, his name was Howard. And Howard was incredibly wealthy. And Howard came to Kevin one day, and Howard had just built this house on probably 40 or 50 acres, beautiful home, estate. I mean, it was one of these that would be in a magazine, just gorgeous, gorgeous home. And Howard came to Kevin a few months after this house was completed being built. And he said, Kevin, if you ever want to use my home for a youth ministry gathering of any kind, anything you want to use it for, I want you to ask. I want you to use my house. And so Kevin came to me and said, good news. We had not been to Howard. We hadn't been to Howard's house. He said, hey, Howard said we could use this house for anything we wanted to do. And I said, well, let's plan an event. And so we got an event on the books. It was a couple months away. It was in the middle of February. We loaded up a couple, buses and vans, and we pulled up to Howard's house and started unloading the vans. Now, if you've ever done any work with students at all, you know this is true, whether as a teacher or whether in youth ministry or young life or whatever it is. You know this is true, that in a group of 100 kids or 200 kids or even 30 kids, there's always that one kid that you end up stressing about all the time. You know what I'm talking about? Was anybody here? Was anybody that kid? I mean, you just want to admit it? I was that kid. And our one kid in our student ministry, his name was Stuart. And we loved Stuart, but Stuart was shot out of a cannon 24/7. That's just who he was. And we knew any event we had, either Stuart was going to the hospital or he was putting somebody in the hospital. That's just how it worked. And so we constantly stressed over Stuart. In fact, the day this event started, I saw Stuart pick up somebody's mom who was there to help cook food, give her a bear hug, and crack 3 of her ribs. I mean, he was just one of those kind of kids. So we get to Howard's house, we're unloading the vans, and Kevin comes over to me and he says, hey, you're on Stuart duty for the next 2 days. And I said, all right, I'm on Stuart duty. So we get into the house and we start, just having a good time. There was an indoor basketball court, indoor swimming pool. And to be honest, 2 hours into it, I totally lost track of Stuart. I mean, we were playing basketball, just having a good time. Well, Howard comes up to me and he says, hey, would you like a tour of the house? I said, absolutely. So we're walking around the house and this is the Italian marble. This is the fountain in the bedroom. This is part of the landscape. He takes me into the security room at one point, one of those kind of houses. And there's a big, sort of panel where you can, like a switchboard, and then there's about 20 security cameras where you can monitor all the actions of all the kids around the house. And I'm looking at these security monitors, and I look up on monitor number 7, and there's Stuart. And he is stripped down to his underwear, and there is a fountain in the front yard of Howard's house. It's the middle of February, by the way. The fountain is going. And there's Stuart. He has scaled it. He is on the very top, and he is just rocking back and forth in his underwear trying to knock this fountain down. And I think in this moment, I'm about to lose my job. And I'm hoping Howard doesn't see it. But a few minutes go by, and Howard looks over at me. There's Stuart in the fountain. Yeah, I see that. You want me to go get him, man? I'm going to go. I'm going to take care of it. I'm so sorry. He's like, nah, don't worry about it. Just walks out, continues the tour. About 10 years later, 10 years passed, and I never brought up that fountain incident again. I'm having lunch with Howard one day, and I said, Howard, I got to ask. I said, do you remember that day in the security room and the fountain and Stuart trying to break your fountain? And Howard goes, oh, yeah, that fountain hasn't worked in 10 years. I drive past it every day. I said, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell me to go in there and, get him and fix it and kick him out of the youth ministry? He said, isn't it true? He said, what I knew about Stuart, he said, didn't he have a troubled home life? I said, yeah. So wasn't that student ministry the only safe place for Stuart? Yeah, it was. And we went to Howard's house 100 times. I have no idea all the things Stuart broke when he was there. But I have a feeling that when we get to heaven, I don't know what it's going to look like, but Howard's going to be standing there, and I've lost touch with both of them, and Stuart's going to be standing there, and Howard's going to give, Stuart's going to give Howard a big old bear hug, maybe even crack a few of his ribs, and say, thank you. Then I was 16, and I didn't have anywhere to go. You didn't treat a fountain in your yard as more valuable than my soul. Thank you that you used your stuff as a place. And he's going to have a heavenly friend because when he was in this world, he understood that his stuff was a tool. All of the possessions that you've been given, all of the things that you have, whether a 7,000 square foot house or a 70 square foot apartment, God says it is a tool. And as a manager, I want you to think about how you can make an eternal difference in somebody's life with the things that you've been given. Money, when you're a manager, not an owner, is a tool in the hand of God for eternal purposes. He keeps going in the story. This is the brilliance of Jesus. He says this, whoever, verse 10, again, he's talking about eternity, can be trusted with very little, can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. He's talking about eternity. He's talking about if you're dishonest in this life, what about heaven? The age to come is how it would be described in the world of Jesus. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth on this side of eternity, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, a manager of God's stuff while you're alive in this world, who will give you property of your own? And I don't understand it all, but Jesus is essentially teaching that something about your life in the age to come, in heaven, hell, however all that works out, is impacted by your life here in this world. And that something about this life and how you handle money, possessions impacts if God trusts you with responsibilities and the resources of God in the next life. I don't know how all that works, but I know this: Christianity teaches at the core of it an idea that your life is going to go on forever. That death is not final. Christianity teaches that death is a seamless transition into another reality, heaven or hell. This is what Christianity teaches. Your soul will, in effect, go on forever. You could think of it this way. This is your life right here. Now you're like, well, that's actually a jump rope, but hang with me for a second. This is your life. And all metaphors break down eventually, but imagine this jump rope goes on around the world about 500 times. And that's your life. It goes on forever. And this part right here is the time you get on earth. That's it. From the vantage point of God, your life is eternal. We don't think of it that way. We think about now. We think about retirement, saving up. But from the vantage point of God, he sees it all, that your soul is going to live on beyond this life. And heaven in the scriptures is not a less real kind of a place. It's a more real kind of a place. But it goes on forever and ever and ever. And the scriptures teach that your soul is being shaped every single day by 1,000 little choices. And your soul, even when your body expires, will continue. And Jesus is teaching that something about how you handle money in this life, can you be trusted with the possessions of God, will impact whether or not or how you are trusted with the possessions of God in this life. C.S. Lewis says it this way, and I read C.S. Lewis when I get confused because he's so brilliant, but he says this: Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. This is true of you and of me. And this must be either true or false. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I was going to live for only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Perhaps my bad temper or my jealousy are gradually getting worse, so gradually that the increase in 70 years will not be very noticeable. But it might be absolute hell in 1,000,000 years. In fact, if Christianity is true, I love this, hell is the precisely correct technical term for what it would be. Your soul's being shaped by 1,000 little moments in this life. He says this at another place. He says, hell begins in this part with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others, but you are still distinct from it. You may even criticize it in yourself and wish you could stop it, but there may come a day when you can no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood or even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself, going on forever like a machine. It is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us, there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. And he's essentially saying, you apply this to money and possessions, that if you're greedy and your soul's being shaped by greed, and if you view possessions as your stuff, your money for you in this world, your soul is being shaped by that. And maybe in 70 years, it doesn't matter that much. But in eternity, God says, you're not going to be trustworthy with my possessions in the age to come, because your soul was contaminated in this place. And you might hear that and go, well, I'm already, $600,000 in debt. I could never climb out of it in my lifetime. But if you begin getting your life and heart and soul on the right path with money, maybe by the time you die, you're $200,000 in debt, but you've at least started to put your soul on the right path. And I know what Jesus is teaching here, even though I don't understand it all, that money is a test. It's not just a tool, it's a test. And God wants to know in this life, are you trustworthy with what I have given to you? Because something about that determines, are you trustworthy in the life and in the age to come? I don't understand it all, but I know that what Jesus is teaching is that money is not just a tool, but money is a test. He goes on, I would be done teaching if I'm Jesus. I would imagine the crowd is thinning as he explains more and more. But he says this, no one, verse 13, can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be destroyed, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. He doesn't say you can't serve both God and the devil. He says you cannot serve both God and money. And he's teaching the people that something is going to end up on the throne of your heart. And Jesus knows that the odds are very good that it will either be God or money. You have to choose. But it cannot be both. And whatever we choose will trademark our life. And how we handle money is not just a tool and it's not just a test. How you and I handle our possessions in this life is a trademark on your life. Because how you handle money is a trademark because it tells the world who you belong to. Who's your master? Who rules over you? Is it God or is it money? Some of us, you've experienced it this way. You've experienced this Game of Thrones between God and money, sort of the tug of war. You've experienced it this way. You started coming to church. You started reading the scriptures, some of the things that Jesus says to do. Love one another, serve one another, give to one another. And you had a moment when you were reading that where you thought, I wish I could do that, but I can't. Visa will not let me. And you realize that what didn't happen by design, it happened by default. Money became your master. And all of your headspace, all of your energy, all of your arguments with your spouse have become about money. And it rules over your life. It controls your life. And you couldn't even begin to follow Jesus with your possessions if you wanted to. And so if that's you and you're going, money by default, not by design, has taken control. It's my master. It's where all of my pressure points are. It's where all of my stress is. And we play this game in our culture. If I can just make more, I can finally climb out of this game. It never has worked in the past, and it certainly will not work in the future. The only way out of this Game of Thrones is to say, God, I want you to sit on the throne of my heart, and I want money to be in its proper place as a tool, not as a God. Jesus never teaches that money is a bad thing. He teaches that money is a terrible God, and it has a place as a tool, as a test, and as a trademark to determine who you and I belong to. If this is you and you go, you know what, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But as you listen to that, you go, I am so stressed out about money because we are up to our ears in debt. We have, over leveraged, under leveraged, every possible way you could be leveraged financially. We are just up to our ears in chaos financially. We want to offer you a class, and this begins in 3 weeks. It's called FPU, Financial Peace University. And we want to offer you this class, not because we want something from you, but because we want something for you. Freedom, a sense of peace. That when you think about money, when a bank statement comes, when the credit card statement comes, that there wouldn't be that bubbling up of anxiety and fear because this area of your life has been so out of control for so long. That's how our world operates. And Jesus says, for my disciples, if you're gonna follow me, I wanna be the one who controls your thoughts, your energy, your efforts, your life. I wanna be on the throne, not money. And if that's you, you can go to our website, thechurchatRB.org, and there's a link on our website. It's gonna be front and center where you can sign up for Financial Peace University. It begins in 3 weeks. It's an 8-week class. And this isn't about trying to get something from anybody. This is about us as a church reading the scriptures and saying, we want something for everybody, a sense of freedom in this particular area. You can go to our website, thechurchatRB.org. There's gonna be more information about that class. It begins in 3 weeks. And if this is you and you're going, I don't even know where to begin, I would strongly encourage you, it's gonna fill up fast, to go to our website and sign up for that class so that you can begin to put money in its proper place and experience that freedom that Jesus wants you and me to experience. Let's pray together. God, I thank you today that you have entrusted each and every one of us in this room with money. Some of us a little bit, some of us a lot. And God, I just pray, I can't do this under my own power. Songs can't do that. Only you, God, can do this, where you bring our hearts into alignment with your heart, our sight into alignment with your sight, to see money as you see it, as a tool, as a test, as a trademark. And I pray over every single one of us in this room, we would begin to experience the peace that you were inviting your followers to experience 2,000 years ago. God, I pray for somebody that's here that there is a battle over the throne of their heart, and they're just not so sure which way they're gonna go. I pray, Spirit of God, they would trust you with the throne of their heart. Like many of us in this room could stand up and say, God, money doesn't make a good king. We don't make good kings of our life. Only you, the giver and creator of all things, makes a good king of our life. I pray for us, God, over the next few weeks, as we walk through these ideas and your concepts about money, would we trust that your words are timeless and true? It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.